Alrighty, so welcome back to week 8, day 1. Today we're going to be talking about HTTP clients. Specifically, we'll mostly be focusing on curl, and then how to fetch from an API in a bit more detail using HTML. So curl is a command line utility. So it's spelled CURL. I do not remember what the acronym stands for, but Google is your friend. And curl is available on pretty much every single command line that exists. So it's a simple way for you to make requests to APIs or websites or anything like that. So the way that we can use curl is by simply saying curl and then putting in the address of whatever we want. So a nice little one to do is example.com, which is one of the simplest websites in existence. If you take a look at the HTML code, apart from all of the styling, it quite literally has one div with like one, two, three constituent elements. Super simple, and it's a good thing to do if you're testing code and making sure that your requests work. So when you apply curl and just do curl and the name of whatever your source is, what type of request does this look like? Or let's backtrack a second. When I say curl www.example.com, are we providing any information to example.com?
No, it just looks like we're trying to reach it.
We're just asking, right?
Pretty much. So if we're just trying to reach it, then what type of request would that be if we're not providing any information? So if we aren't providing information, we can't update anything.
A
It's like,
GET request?
yes, it's a GET request. Thank you. I think that was both Sean and Mike who were speaking. All right. Yeah, well, good work, guys. Yeah, then this is a GET request. And if you just do curl blank, most, if not all the time, it will give you a GET request. But that's not always the case. So we can modify your curl to to be other forms of requests as well. So the way we can specify that is, okay, let me make sure I remember this. We can do a curl and then a dash x. And after the dash x, you can specify your method. So we could say curl dash x and then get, and we should be able to do that again, example.com. And we see again, it carried out a get request. Now, we could also do a post request, but there isn't really much point in doing a post. But if we did want to do a post request, the format for that would be curl-x post, or you could do a put or a patch, etc. And then whenever we make a post request, we always have to specify a header. So in general, when we specify our headers, you'll want to you want to tell it a content type and tell it what you want to get back. So for example, one very common one is application JSON, because you want to get data back in the JSON format, which is essentially nested dictionaries. But there are others. Usually you'll use JSON though. And then you need to specify the fields for your post request. We can do that using -d and then just put that in as a dictionary. So we won't go through that exercise right now, but because there isn't really anything that we can post to example.com, but that's the format that we can use. So I think as one of you said at the start, this is pretty much identical to what we can do with Postman, except one benefit of curl is that it's in the command line. So if you really like working in the command line, curl is a good choice. Also, Postman can sometimes take a little bit of time to spin up. And if you already have the code written for your post or put requests with the specific domains and fields and header information, you can, as strings, you can just copy paste those right away. So makes it a little bit easier for testing. But in general, we tend to only use curl for testing most of the time. It does not really have a utility in JavaScript or in any other parts of front-end dev. Does that sort of help clarify things a little bit? Any questions about that before we get back to fetching? All right, so let's go ahead and switch over from the command line to VS Code. All right, so today we're going to walk through a little mini project, and this is also in the week 8, day 1 README, um, where we're going to make a very basic application that lets a user select one currency and see the exchange rates for that currency relative to another. So let's just make a very simple boilerplate HTML page. So we'll just create our opening and closing tags. We should probably specify a header. And in that, we can probably link to our style sheet. So we can say link rel is going to be style sheet, and the href is going to be style.css because we already created that. And we can also create a script. You can say script source is going to be app.js. And we can have our closing script tag. Perfect. That's our header. And then we can go ahead and make a simple body. We can have a nice, let's create a new div, and we'll just say div ID is going to be page title. We can put like an h1 tag in there and say, this is the title of my page. Or here, actually, we don't even need a div. We can just do that. Even easier. And then we should probably have something in there that lets you select the currency that we're looking for. So I'm just going to put this in as a simple boilerplate method to select currency. And then remember that, so the thing that we're looking to do, I'll just do this all the way at the top, is user wants to select a currency from a range of options, view exchange rates for that currency. So we should probably have a method to select that currency, and it might also be good to have a method or something way to display the exchange rates of other currencies relative to it. So that's going to be the broad format of our web page. So we can make maybe some divs. Let's call this one exchange rates. We'll just keep that text in there as a placeholder. The nice thing about HTML as well is you can just add text as placeholders and things instead of comments. So you don't have to worry about necessarily formatting it. So here, let's also just add in a div for that select currency thing. So we'll say div ID is going to be select currency, and we'll make our div. Okay, so let's start to break this down. What HTML tool can I use in order to give a user options from which they can select something?
An
Can you
unordered
repeat the
list.
question?
So what is the best, what is the easiest slash best way to let a user pick a specific or just choose a currency out of a list of currencies.
I was gonna say
Mm.
unordered list. I don't know if there's a down menu function or something, but unordered list comes to the mind. UL?
Yeah.
All right. So let's see. So we could say UL, open that up, and then we could create list elements. And we could say, let's say USD. We could have UR. Um, and we'll just do one more. Uh, pounds. Okay. That's probably good. So let's go ahead and see what this website looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up, index.html. So let's go and share that screen. All right, can you guys see my browser now? Okay,
Yes.
cool. I'm sharing on two monitors, so we'll see. Hopefully that doesn't break. So unordered list is a good idea, except can we do anything with the bullet points? Or more specifically, can right now, as it looks like, can I interact with those bullet points at all?
No.
No. So that is a good try, and that's close, but that's not necessarily what we're looking for. And I'll give you a hint. It isn't necessarily a list structure. So what other
Could you
options
have,
do we have?
do a radio button, like input type radio?
Okay, we can do that. So said input type is radio. And where can we go from there? What would that format look like?
Can you change it to your HTML so we can see what you're typing?
Oh, that's a great idea. And this is the problem with having two screens. So how can we create a radio button?
Do we need to create a form first?
Actually, you might not need to create a form. Actually, nope, never mind. Yeah, you probably would need to create a form for it. This is a good point. Um, but what we could do, well, that is one option. But the way that radio buttons work is a little bit interesting. So we could do a radio, but we'd have to create an individual radio button for every single option. So we'd have to also give them each a different ID. So we could say this would be like USD, and then the label, we'd have to create a label for this, which would be 4 is for USD. Nope, type and then type its value. And we would have to repeat this process a couple of times. So we'd have to do that for our next option. And then we can do it one more time. And let's see. That's how you spell Great British Pound. 2 and 3. So if we go back to take a look at our web page, this is what it looked like before. And if we refresh it, oh, I kept the list there. And oh, I'm going to also add some break returns very quickly, just to make the formatting better. So if we take a look now, we see that we do indeed have radio buttons. However, the problem, as I believe somebody outlined before, it may have been Danielle or Megan, so I apologize for not remembering, is I can't unselect any of these, number one. Number two, if I want to select them one at a time, I will actually have to put them in a form or a field set. And number three, if let's say later my user says, I don't just want 3 currencies, I want 45. Then I'm going to have to go and essentially create 45 different lines of input type equals ID equals label equals, and that's going to take a little while. So radio buttons, while those are a good idea, are not necessarily the best ones for this. There is one option that we haven't touched on yet that is extremely useful when looking to select things. And this is quite literally called the select element. So we can create a name for what this field is going to be. We could say the name of this is going to be currency. And the ID of this, we can just say select element. And inside our select statement, we can put a bunch of different options that we can select. So we can say, first we need to set the value of the option. And we can say that this one is just going to be blank. We can create another one for our currency. So we'll do that. Let's do that a couple of times. So we have USD. We have, oh, meant to do that out here. CAD, and we have GBP. And we should also probably update the values. So I have USD, CAD, and GPB. So we have three different methods that we can use to display things. And here, let me, oops. Here, let me just refresh my page and make sure that it actually refreshes. Oh, I mistyped it. That's why. It's supposed to be
Should be
option singular.
option, right?
Thank you. I was like, something is not displaying right. Let me figure out why before I hit share screen.
I was literally Googling and I'm like, is there an options?
I think that's probably called a typo. But yeah, good catch. Thank you. So, all right, here, let's go back and refresh this and see if it's actually, there we go. That's the appropriate size. So if we click the drop down, well, first off, let me go back. The select statement is what we can use to create a drop down. So you have your input, which allows you to create buttons and text fields and things like that. But if you want to have a nice simple thing that you can click and to show a bunch of things, select for now is the best way to go. There are others that are more complicated that we can use using JSX and other things like that, but we will not touch that right now. That's for when we get into some of the Django and React stuff for front end. So every single option that you specify is going to be one row or option in the drop-down list. Now, we'll notice that here we have, if we go back to the code for a second, back to screen one, we have options that each have a value and the actual words that show up on the drop-down menu. So I can change its USD. USD is an American dollar, something like that. So if we go back to our drop-down and I refresh the page, we see here that the thing that I put inside of that option close option in HTML is what shows up on our drop-down list. However, you may ask, well, what's the point of that value equals field in the code if that doesn't show up anywhere? And the answer is this value equals is what gets sent back into your JavaScript whenever the user clicks on one of the select fields or one of the fields and sets it. So you can end up typing a bunch of different things in any of these fields, but the only value that JavaScript will read back is your user has selected a value or has selected something in that dropdown where that something's value is whatever mini thing you specify here. Any questions about select? I know that was a
Yeah.
little bit of a brief intro.
Yeah, so in the JavaScript, you're probably going to do this and show us, but when you're putting the variable to the ID and your ID is select element, that select element is going to be the value of whatever's put in there, then I take it, whatever's selected.
Yep.
Okay.
So we're going to basically what we need to do is we need to figure out a way for us to essentially select that or get the backphrase or rephrase. What we need to do in JavaScript now that we have this element set up, first thing we need to do is figure out how to access its value. The second thing we need to figure out is how to access its value when the user changes it. And then based on what the user changes it to, do something in order to display the exchange rates. So here, let's change this back to just being US dollar. We can change this to Canadian dollar, and we can change this to British pound. So this is a pretty simple website. We've just got our page title, and we don't need the list or the inputs anymore. We can just rename that title now to say select your currency. And then we need to do something inside of this exchange rates div. So we'll skip the styling for now because as everyone knows, CSS styling is boring and not something that we're going to touch right now. But on the README, I think there's like a relatively nice CSS file that you can copy paste that formats things pretty decently on your end if you'd like to do that. All right, so we've got our app.js file, which we've already sent in as our script. So that should be good to run. The first thing that we need to do is we need to say, first we need to figure out what the user has selected in, what did I call that? The ID of this is select element. So does anyone remember how I can access the value of something with an ID in JavaScript or CSS?
The hash.
Yes, it's with the hashtag. Perfect. So it would be hashtag select, I forgot what I called it again, element. So what about the dot? If I were to change the hashtag to a dot, what would that get at?
A class.
Yes, perfect. And if I just removed it completely and I did select element, assuming that were to work,
You would be selecting like a node within HTML, so like div, like all the divs or something like that.
yeah, perfect. What I would be hoping for is that, again, pretending to type HTML, that would be looking for something called select element, like so. So as you said, Tisdale, we want to look for the hashtag. So first we need to figure out what the user selected. And then we need to, so what currency the user has selected. We're going to need to get the relevant exchange rates between that currency and the other currencies. And then let's see, what else do we want to do? Probably have to modify our, what did we call our HTML element? Exchange rates. I'm going to call this display. There's also no harm in making your IDs more descriptive than less. Is a little bit more typing? Sure. But we also have the miracle of autocomplete. So we can modify our hashtag exchange rates display. I think that's what I called it. Yes, exchange rates display to display the all of the exchange rates. I think that's about it. So let's break this down into its components. So we've now said we have, I guess, 3 functions. But when do we want our JavaScript code to run?
When they click a button.
We could do it when you click a button.
On window load?
We could do it also on window on load, which is the easier option, and that's what we'll do now. However, as you said, Tisdale, we can make it on a button click. So for today's homework assignment, if you want to, you're welcome to try that. But for a button click, you're basically going to add a event listener that instead of looking for a change in the field in the selected field, you look for a change in the value of a button, or like a submit button. But it's essentially the same principle. So the first thing that we'll want to do is we'll open this up with our window dot on load, and we'll make this our little fat arrow functions. Now, unfortunately, in JavaScript, fat arrow functions do rear their ugly head more than we'd like. So if you don't like the formatting too much, unfortunately, it is the norm. Unlike in Python, where fat arrow functions are not used very much, thank goodness. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we'll need to add in a event listener. So let's make the comment for that and say event listener, do all of the below when the user has selected something. So we should probably first figure out how to get what the user selected. So we can say we can define a constant. Oh, here, let me also indent all of this. That's better. So we can say selector, just a random name, is going to be, now, how can I access an element?
A query selector.
All right, and can I just type query selector like that?
And then you have a document before.
Perfect. Yes. So whenever we're referring to something from HTML, or something from an HTML page, you always need to use document dot, because that refers back to the HTML document that is referring to your JavaScript code. Is it convoluted? Slightly. But is it necessary? Yes. So yeah, we'll use our document.query selector, and then we can just specify that that is going to be in our ID of select element. All right, so once we have our selector done, that should tell us this div ID. However, how often does it tell us that?
On load, just so like when the document's done being brought up, then it runs the JavaScript, right? That's
Right.
it.
Yep, and that's because of the onload. So if I click around a little bit and make some changes, has the window reloaded itself? No. So will our selector variable be updated automatically? Also no. So the way that we can do that is by adding in that event listener. And we can do that by adding in let's see, selector dot add event listener. Again, the miracles of autocomplete. And now we need to break down the event listener. You guys have dealt with event listeners before, correct? Okay, perfect. So, all right, quiz time. What type of event listener are we looking for here? All right, on click is one option, but let's see. If I so here we can go back to the web page for a second
They're like
before
a
we
load listener. I guess I haven't looked at all the listeners.
On select.
Say the selection one, yeah.
here. Let me share the screen again. So hypothetically, I could click the same option a bunch of times and nothing would change. Would it? Now, think about it this way. Every single time that we run this JavaScript code, we have to make an API call. Is it a good idea? And now also, some APIs are free, which the one that we're going to use tonight, thankfully, is, but some of them are paid. And some APIs can be kind of expensive. So hypothetically, let's say that we were to make our event listener be an on click. So every single time I click an option, I'm going to make a 10-cent API call every single time I click it. Now, that might be fine if you have a user that's intelligent and says, all right, I'm going to visit this website and I know exactly which currency I'm going to look at. I'm only interested in USD. Ding, 10 cents. Now, let's say that you accidentally, your cat decides to walk on your keyboard and it decides to click 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times on the USD field. Has the value of that field changed at all? No. But you've clicked it repeatedly. So because you've clicked it every single time, that then ups your API charge from charging for one API call to charging for 7. So because of that, an on-click may not be the best idea for this specific application. But that is another option. That is an option. But does that make sense? Any questions about why we so on-click can sometimes be dangerous for that reason. Instead, a nice simple one that we can use is change. That basically just says if the value of my variable changes at all, then run whatever code I need you to. So the way that we can tell that it's changed is first we need to create our event listener, and then we're going to use our fat arrow function and say that we're going to make a request to the, let's see. Well, we need to define the function make request, but essentially we'll want to do something where make request is a function that changes our event, we can just call it event target value. All right, so I just wrote some random code. Let's break it down line by line. So the first thing we're doing is we're adding in this event listener for our select element. So it'll say, did we change the value of what we've selected? If we did, then note that down as an event, well, the event we're calling E. Its target is going to be the select element, and we want the value that has been selected. So let's go back to our index.html and see what we get. So that's where these option values come in handy. So the reason we have those values there is when something changes in our select element, select statement, we will then get returned the value. So the other option we could do just to test this is we can do a console log and say log the value every single time it changes. So let me go back to HTML and we'll go to inspect, and I'm going to share screen. Why are you saying there's an issue? That's fine. Okay, so let's try this. So if I change the value, and everyone can see my HTML code, right? Okay, so if I change the value now from, well, let's refresh it one more time. It starts out as blank. So the window is loaded. Have I changed anything in my dropdown yet? No, because I haven't clicked anything. So we don't see anything in the console. Now let's say that I click in here. If I click once, nothing seems to have changed, because indeed, nothing's changed. And if I select this blank thing again, nothing's changed. Let's say now I want to go look at the exchange rate for the British pound. I click British pound. Now the value of the field has changed. So because our event listener, it then gets the value, which is of our British pound option, which we set as GPB in that option value equals field. I can change it again to something else, and it gives us the value for that. And I can even change it back to blank, and it gives us a blank value. So going back to our code in the app.js, by adding the event listener at like so, we're only changing things when we need something new to be displayed, which in our case is only when the value of that field changes.
How is that different from click?
So on click will change it every time you click on it.
every time you click on the drop down.
Are you basically saying that all those values in the dropdown have already reached out to an API, gathered the data then at that point?
No. So that is going to be the next part of what we have to do. So
Right, but is that the intent though? That's what I'm getting at. Like you've already
Oh,
filled this out in one onload, and then on change, basically, you already have it in your data structure.
not
I'm still trying to
exactly.
see how you're not hitting the API because you had a good question. Then how you're not hitting the API every time with the change.
So the difference is with on click, I could click it 15 times and click on the same option 15 times, and it would make the same call 15 times. So if I just repeatedly clicked on the drop down and clicked USD, 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 it's not getting new data back, but it's making the call and getting back the same data like 15 times.
But if
Versus,
we select like Canada and they're like, oh, I meant US dollar, then that would be 2 times, right? So it still can be a lot of times, but not as many as click.
exactly, yeah. That being said, the best way to have this done is, and both of you are correct, make one API call, get the entire database back, preload it somewhere, especially if it's a small database, and then that way everything's just running locally and it's super simple. However, sometimes, especially for large databases, like databases for stock trading, or things where you absolutely need an API where there's like literally thousands of options, we can't always do that, which is where, oh, let me switch to the app.js, which is where the event listeners come in handy. But we will be getting into setting up databases and how those can be stored. I think that's actually next module. Yeah, that kicks off next week. But so for now, we do have to do things slightly inefficiently, but that will change soon. All right. So, any other questions, by the way, before we keep moving on the requests?
So is there a secondary click for this particular, so for change, is it you select and then press a button kind of thing? Is that how that operates?
So the change the change type of event listener will essentially check if the value of the target has changed. So you just click one time, or you don't even have to
And
click.
then it updates the variable once that click's been made.
Yes,
Got it.
or assuming the variable is changed. So you could use that, for example. Change is great for text fields. So I've had to do this once or twice where if you're trying to, let's say, let's pretend that you're working on a website that needs to do like autocomplete. So, or for example, Google's a great example of this. If you go to google.com and you start typing, with every single character you type, Google will update that little drop down of potential search terms, right? That is essentially based on change. Because what it says is if the thing that you're typing has changed, then modify the search and whatnot. Then when you hit the search button, that would be an on click, for example. Or I guess if it's a form, it would be on submit.
So not to get too far off on this, but is this a form of debouncing or is this something completely different?
What do you mean by debalancing?
Debouncing. Um,
Oh,
it's like a
um,
function that would only execute based on an algorithm.
kind of. Yeah, you could say that using change instead of on click is a you could say it's a type of debouncing, but I would not complicate it that much. So debouncing is essentially a way for um, to prevent users from running a function 15 times in a row, like repeatedly. Um, I think it might be a stretch to say that's what change is doing. You can use it to do that, but then you'd probably want to add in time delays and other things like that. So I would have to say no. But real quick, I just want to see if I can find a link to types of event listeners because there are a lot of different types of event listeners that you can use. Um, yeah, there's like click, mouse over, um, oh, oh boy, and now my computer is deciding to freeze. There we go. Okay, I'm gonna put this in the Slack channel so you guys can check this out later. But there are a bunch of different types of events. So again, change is very common, click is very common. Um, Sometimes you might even have mouse over. So if you're dragging your mouse over something, you can change its color. Um, let's see, what are other ones? Um, Sometimes people have ones on like on load or on unloading, um, on media playing. Yeah, there's a bunch. So check that out at your convenience. However, that is not the focus of tonight's lecture. So with the event listener tangent done, let's get back to the main thing for today, which is for APIs. And you guys can still see app.js, right? Okay, cool. So we did our event list. So we have our selector. We've now figured out what currency the user wants. So now we need to actually get the relevant exchange rates. So for that, a function's never a bad thing to do. So why don't we design a function that says constant, and let's just say that this is going to be get exchange rates. So what type of function is this? Or okay, let me
Is it
rephrase. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
like the fetch data?
Kind of. I guess the main thing I was thinking is that the function we're designing is going to be an asynchronous function. Have you guys seen this term before? Okay,
Yes,
okay, I can see you guys shaking your head. Mike, so do you want to just run me through what an asynchronous function is?
it is a pain in the butt because it returns a promise. I spent time over the weekend, but I'm essentially my understanding is that when you use asynchronous with an await, it's used to await for the data to be returned because if you don't and you just run through, your data will be empty.
Yes.
And it returns a promise object if you are returning anything
Yep.
from an asynchronous function. That is the default of JavaScript. Anytime you use async.
Perfect. Yeah, I could not have done a better job explaining that. So I think to also you can write your fetch functions without async awaits. And I've done that before simply because I wanted to avoid dealing with promises. Do you guys want to know what happened when I did that? It reached out to a really slow API that would take like a full minute to buffer and get data because I was importing, I think it was like 1,000 rows, or it was not a simple import. So I didn't do the async and I didn't do the await because I wanted to be impatient. I hit run the code. It looked great. I didn't see any issues in my debugging. I hit run, and then I started getting errors in everything else. It's like, what just happened? What happened was that it didn't have enough time to send the data, much less get it back. So, as Mike alluded to, all my data fields were blank when they were really not supposed to be. And then I had a whole host of other issues in the rest of the code. But basically, whenever you do anything with working with APIs in JavaScript, you unfortunately have to expect to deal with an async and an await. So let's do that right now. So we're going to do our async. This should probably take in some input. So we could maybe call this let's call selected currency. And oh, that was supposed to be inside. Okay, so where can we go from here? So we start off with our selected currency. Um, Next, we should probably figure out what API we're going to use. Now, the good news is I already know which API we're going to use, and this is called VAT comply. So let's go back to screen share. So it's a nice little API or it's a nice little website that has a free exchange rate API. Now, if we go and take a look at the documentation, every single time you reference and you try an API, the first thing to do is always go to the documentation because they'll have examples of usage, or at least good API documentation generally does. Now, sometimes you'll find APIs that do not explain the type of the data or the source of the data or anything like that, and it gets really confusing. But they will have examples of the data format. And that can sometimes be one of the most helpful things. So always, always, always go through your API's documentation. So let's see. Which one do you want to go? Historical dates? No. Well, we can probably just use the simple get for our rates. So let's break this down. So this is a simple get request for our fetch. So we know we don't have to post or put or anything like that. We have our URL. So I'm going to copy this and I'm just going to make a variable in my app.js for it. Let's call this like base URL is going to be that. And then we have that's going to be done with HTTP. And then it'll return this in what looks like a JSON format. Now, the date we don't care about. The base, if we wanted to be extra diligent, we would probably want to check that the base being, say here, EUR matches up with the exchange rate that we want. Oh, actually here, we would want to do it with bases USD. There we go. I copied in the wrong one. Oh. Wait, there we go. Okay. So we would want to confirm that this base is USD matches up with whatever our input to the function is. That's always a good thing to check. And then this rate thing is probably going to be the most useful one for us. So let's get back to designing that code. So .js goes here. So we have our base URL for our for our API call. And the way that we can make that API call is going to be, again, you guys should be familiar with this, is we're going to say that we have a result of a await. We're going to then fetch some data from our base URL. And we ideally want to do a string concatenation between that and whatever currency we have selected. So if we want to get the data for USD, then we would type base equals USD. If we want to do it for Canadian dollars, it would be base and then CAD, and then base and then GPB, etc., etc. So once we get our result back, can I just say like return result? Are we done at that point, or do I need to do something with this response object?
Turn it into a JSON or whatever your format is.
Yes. So we can say the result in JSON is going to be result.json. And so also one other thing, when you're turning a response into JSON, it is a function. So, or as in .json is not an attribute. That is a function that you have to run. Also, when you do this, you also, in general, want to await for result.json to run. The reason for this is that some responses can be ginormous. And if you get a massive response and then you forget the await, your code just keeps plowing through, your result.json is going to be blank. Also, we should probably call this a constant. And you know what? Here, let's do a console log results.json. just so we can see what that looks like. Is it result or response JSON? Oh, are you talking about on line 16, Jonathan?
Yeah, when we had the lecture yesterday, they had us using response.json, so I just didn't know if there was a difference or.
Yeah, we can change that. We can call this guy response. We can call that response and call that response.
Yeah, that's just a variable name, right? It doesn't
Yep.
matter what you call it. You can call it pigs if you want.
Yeah. Now, there is a distinction though. If I mouse over response, the response capitalized is the name of the class that is, or the type of thing that gets returned by your fetch. So what you do not want to do is say response.json like so. Otherwise, it's just the variable name, so it doesn't really matter. But usually, some people will say response, some people will say result. Um, Generally, I guess response is more common than result for fetching operations. But so let's go ahead and see what this looks like in our console log. So first, let me make sure. Yeah, Canadian dollar. Okay, cool. That is there. So here, let's go back to this guy and we'll hit refresh. All right, so right now it's blank. So let's go ahead and take a look at our USD. Oh, right. I forgot to change the console log for my event listener to do our get exchange rates function. That explains a lot. All right, let's try that one more time. So select your country. We'll go with US dollar. All right, uncut and promise. Reference error, result.
Because you didn't,
And
you
that's,
changed all to response.
yep. Thank you, Sean. All right, third time's the charm. Let's do drop down. There we go. Perfect. And now we get lovely, lovely JSON. So let's expand this a little bit and let's break it up. So we have this base, we have date, and we have all of the rates. Then we also have this prototype object. In general, you do not need to worry about this prototype object field. There are some times that you may need to look at, say, the toString or the scopes, but for right now, for what we are doing, do not bother about this. Only bother about the things that you expect to be in your response JSON. And as we can see, this looks pretty good. So what we can now, let's go back to that code and figure out what we're going to do with our response. So we have, let's add in some comments. So this is going to be date, base, and then rate is going to be a dictionary. Base is going to be a string, and date is a string, year, month, day. Usually, this is what I like to do is whenever I go through and I am looking at a JSON formatted file, I just like to look at it and write down what the expected data types are and organization is for myself. That way, if it changes at some point, because again, APIs are maintained by people, and people will sometimes change how their API outputs things. Generally, they don't, but sometimes they do. And if that happens, then you can look at the format of the API and then the format that you wrote down and say, aha, here's where things aren't matching up. Helps you solve issues relating to data format relatively quickly. Okay, let me find my mouse again. I think I lost it. Hello? There it is. Okay. So we now have our date, our base, and our rates. So the thing that we actually want is the rates. So presumably we can make we can just call this exchange rates. Let's say current. And that is going to be response JSON dot rates. And I think that's about it. And here we can also do a return exchange rates current. And now we don't need the console log, but I am not a personally, this is just the way I like to code. I'm never a fan of deleting print statements or deleting console logs. Because you never know when you might need them later. So I will always comment them out until like I'm ready for production release, and then I'll go through and make sure I don't have any erroneous console logs or print statements lying around. But keeping them in can be very helpful. All right. So we've now gotten our exchange rates data. Great. What can we do with that? I mean, we can't just, spit out a dictionary on an HTML page. That would be terribly ugly. So what do we need to do? Any ideas? How can we output this data in a nice, pleasant, simple to read or see way?
Well, we want to put it, well, are we going to put it in the string?
That's one option, but is there a way we can output it so that it looks nice on our HTML page instead of just as a single string?
I guess we can make an within the function that where it like creates an element, right? And then it
Perfect.
puts that data in an element.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's
Something like
create
that.
new elements for our exchange rates. So let's go back to that index.html. We already have a div for our exchange rates. And we can forget this for now. That's just, that doesn't need to be there. But we have this div already set up for exchange rates display. So why don't we create a new element for each of our exchange rates? And now I'm going to go ahead and copy over that styling code because that may give us some clues. So in case if you'll take a look, the styling in our style.css refers to a container class, or a container ID, an item that you can hover over, and then a grid template columns. So usually you're supposed to do your styling after writing the code. However, just because, well, I've already seen the code, and to help get the wheels thinking a little bit quicker, if we have a reference to something called a grid template columns, what do you guys think our new elements might be? Or how might this work? Thinking ahead. Okay. I'm going to move the chat to the other screen because I have to keep clicking on it every time I see a notification. All right, interpolation into p tags. That
Can
is an
you look at the
option.
CSS again?
That is probably a good idea. Yeah. So p tags is one option. Are there any others? Yes, and it is in the repo. Thank you, Sean. So also just in general, when we're creating elements in HTML, the general standard is always to create divs. We always talk about people creating nested divs and nesting divs on divs on divs. That is a standard format. Even though p tags are all well and good, and I'm personally in favor of them, just because divs are more flexible and they don't always need you to type paragraphs, people will usually go with divs. So we will be going with, I think Jonathan maybe put a message in the chat, but I couldn't tell. All right, you did. No more deleting messages. I can see all of the answers. But your suggestion of creating div tags is exactly what we're gonna do with the ID of, or with the class of dot item. So, and also, guys, don't be afraid of like putting answers in the chat, even if they may seem completely off base. Half the time your answers are right, or they generate really interesting questions. So, yeah, do not be afraid of doing that. Because again, I can see all the questions.
I
All
mean,
right.
I get the div part, but with the grid thing's throwing me off because I see there's grid CSS, but there isn't a full, like, not all of it that I'm saying.
Do you mean with like the grid template columns?
Yeah, unless I'm mistaken on what that means.
So I think all that's saying is on whatever page it is, they just want you to create, the only thing it'll do is it'll create a maximum of 5 columns.
Let's see. Okay.
So it's not trying to put any restrictions on the number of rows. So that way, if we go back to, well, I'm not going to keep switching between the API and the code to keep it easier, to make it simpler. But let's pretend we didn't know how many currencies our API output. It could output 5, or it could output 67. That would probably change the number of rows that we would have in a grid. And also, just in general, people like web pages to scroll vertically rather than horizontally. So if we didn't know how many items we need to have, we would need to fix either the number of rows or the number of columns. If you fix the number of rows, then your table is going to grow horizontally, which is going to look ugly. Or if you fix the number of columns, then your table is going to grow vertically, which looks better. Which is why, in this case, they've only fixed the grid template columns to be fixed the number of columns specifically. Hopefully that helps answer the question. But all right. So we now have our current exchange rates. And again, this is a dictionary. So this is going to be super important to remember for when we are creating our new elements. So let's see. So we should probably first find a way to convert our exchange rates dictionary into HTML. And then we can do that by calling another function that creates our individual elements. So let's create a function, and we'll call this convert to HTML. And this is going to take in our exchange rates. Rate should be lowercase. And it's going to somehow go through all of the exchange rates and create a new HTML element for each of them. All right, so let's think about how this might work. So the first thing that we'll need to look at is going to be our sorry. We'll need to update the div ID that we're looking at down here. So I'm going to copy this name so that way I'm not going to forget it later. And let's say we're going to have constant. This could be, I guess, display element. And we'll just say that this is document.query selector. And that is the ID. Oh, that should actually be up with our selector. Oh, another thing I should mention. In general, if you are trying to access elements that are hard-coded, so like, for example, a hard-coded element would be like this select bar or the div that I've already coded. You generally want to define those query selectors in, as high of a level as possible. So don't define those in a function. Define those like all the way outside. But if you create any elements like locally or that you haven't hard coded, refer to those inside a function. So we've created our display element. We're able to access that now. And we need to be able to modify that element. So we should probably first set its inner HTML to blank. Then we have display element dot inner HTML is blank. Now the reason for this is every single time that I, make my new API call and I get new data, I don't need the old data anymore. It's not like I'm adding on to it. I'm completely replacing it. So this will effectively, blank out the existing data. So clean slate for new exchange rate info to be displayed. Once we clear that out, let's see, what else can we do? Well, we probably need to also figure out how to iterate through the exchange rates dictionary. So we could probably say iterate through exchange rate dictionary. And then we could say for each exchange rate, create a new element. Yes, so for each is an option. So could do well, let's see. Let me ping this to you guys. We have a dictionary. How can I iterate through a dictionary and only iterate through its keys in JavaScript?
Isn't that a for in? That could be wrong. Like for key in name of dictionary.
That's one option, but that is more of a
Object,
Python
it'd
solution.
be object dot key.
Close. Let's try it. So let's create a new variable. We'll say constant. I think yeah. Let's see. Call this rates array. So you're right that we're gonna want to start with object. Well, let's see if there's a key actually. We could do keys. The other one that exists is entries. So the reason for using entries instead of keys is that that gives you both the key and the key value pairs. So in this case, we don't just want the keys or the values, though we could iterate over those independently. So that is an option. And I probably should have specified that we wanted to do both simultaneously. So we'll use objects.entries. Yeah, as JavaScript calls it, properties and methods, which I think sounds way worse than key value pairs. But you can go with whichever format you want. And we'll do that for our exchange rates dictionary. And now we can do what Justin said in the chat, which is we can do our for each. So let's do that, and we can do for each, and then we have to do something in our for each. So we'll have to
KV. And then wouldn't that be like an array type? So key value of.
alternatively, we could create a new function where we do all of that. So the other thing for, especially in JavaScript, more so than in HTML, breaking things into functions is totally okay and welcomed. And sometimes breaking things into functions increasingly is not a bad thing because then you can reuse those functions multiple times over. So we're going to make a function here. We're going to call create element based on, I'm going to call this exchange rate KV. So that way we know what it's referring to. And that is where our function down here is going to come in handy. So you can say constant, create HTML ER element, so ER for exchange rate. And I'll say this is based off of exchange rate key value pair. Oh, here, I'll keep using the fat arrow function notation just to stay consistent. And then now we can get to what Justin was talking about. So, Justin, how would you, since you were already discussing this, how would you think about going about turning our key value pairs into an HTML element?
Hmm. I
Or anyone
think.
else who wants to chime in too, not to pick on Justin.
Now, what is that? Create node or something? Can't remember off the top of my head.
Close.
Create element? No.
Bingo. Create
Oh,
element.
because you
Yes.
said you're saying create so much it didn't jive.
So let's say that let's call this I don't know, new element. There we go. And we can do, so remember, every time we change anything in HTML, it's going to be a reference to document dot. And let's see, can I scroll down? I can. There we go. Create element. If I can mouse over that, create. Okay, I think it'll only do it if I do that. There we go. It creates the instance of an element for a specified tag. Now, earlier when we were talking about what type of element. And if I remember correctly, we're going to want to create a div. And we could do an H1 tag, you could do a P tag, you could, I guess, do a break return if you wanted to, but we're just going to keep it simple and do a div. Now, what are the conditions that we have for our div? So divs have a couple of things that we can attribute to them. So what do divs have? So divs have a class, they have an ID, and they have inner text. Now, if we go back to HTML to interpret that, this is going to be, your class is going to be that, your ID is going to be whatever your ID is, and then your inner text of a div is what goes between your opening and closing tags of your div. That's the way it is for most HTML elements, is at the very least, you'll have a class, an ID, and the thing that goes between the opening and closing tags. So let's forget the class for now. Let's go back to app.js. So the first thing we should probably do is we can set that inner text, because our inner text is just going to be, the key value pairs that we have. So we can say new element dot, inner HTML, but we're not doing an HTML, we're doing text, equals exchange rate KV. All right, so that's knocked out. Do we need to set the div class? Let's go through here. Oh, container. What is container? Oh, I forgot to change the name. That was this. Let's go style. Oh, style. No. Okay. No, I do not want to open an external website. Stop clicking things. Okay, there we go. So the ID that we're looking for is .item. So we can specify new element .id is going to be item, or sorry, not ID. Oops, class. Let's see, class
Class name.
name. Thank you. And then, so this effectively creates our new ID or our new element. However, have we specified anywhere in this function, which is a parent, or which calls our create HTML element? Oh, here. That's what I wanted to do. Have we ever specified where this element is getting created?
No, because we didn't append child, right? Append child node or something like that.
Yes, it's append child. You got it right the first time. So now what we need to do is go back to that display element, which is the thing whose data we blanked out. And now we can append child, and we can append our brand new element that we've created. So to recap, When you load the page, we're going to see if anything's changed. Nothing changed because I just loaded the page. So it should be blank. Now I'm going to change something in my field. I'm going to choose my currency. When I choose a currency, that field's value changes to whatever currency I've selected. So I'm going to get the exchange rates between that currency and all the other currencies using my API with the, as Mike put it, the very annoying async await. It is annoying, but it is necessary, because if you don't do the async await, you could end up processing data that hasn't hit you yet, and then your code breaks. So here, again, because we're getting this back and we're interpreting it as JSON data, we are being returned a dictionary of exchange rates and of exchange rate symbols and values. Once we get that dictionary, we can turn it into an array and get its key value pairs out. And for each key value pair, we can create an HTML element with that as dinner text and put that inside of our final div ID of exchange rates display. So hypothetically, if this all works without any typos, I'm going to go back to sharing second screen. I'll hit refresh. So if I select a currency, let's say I'm going to select the US dollar. Yes, that is exactly what I wanted to happen, which was nothing. All right, time to debug this code very briefly, and then I promise we will get to questions. So we have the event listener, we know that works. We tested that get exchange rates does work because that gets called. And let's see. Oh, this function is slightly grayed out
As I
because
say,
we
it's not
never
being
called
used.
convert to HTML.
Are we using that arrays part in there too? The rates arrays dot for each, or did you?
Yep, that is getting used.
Okay.
Yeah, but good catch. So the other nice thing about VS Code is if you can pick up on if or you can also increase change different color schemes, but it will tell you if you've never used a variable. So in this case, we never referred to convert to HTML, which we kind of need to do because once we run that, then that function runs create the HTML elements, which actually creates the things that we want to display. So let's go back, make sure that is saved. Hit refresh one more time, and we'll go US dollar. There we go. All right. So, and now, Justin, this goes back to your question about the CSS and why we only have columns. So, if we take a look here, and I can, change the size of my screen. Nope, that is a bunch of other stuff. If I change the size of my screen marginally, it will shrink and grow the columns as needed, but it won't change anything about the number of rows. So it'll always keep it as the 5 columns, or it'll do its best to. But that's where the 5 column thing comes in. We could change that hypothetically, and I can do that now. Maybe we can change it to be let's say 6 columns instead. Hit refresh. And we now see that it now has 6 columns. We could change it to rows as well, but it would have the adverse effect that we talked about before. So let's say now instead of using the US dollar, I'm going to change it to Canadian, and we see that all of the values update. So again, it clears the HTML first, and then it loads up the new data. Now we can go back to US dollar, or we can go to British pound. Oh, and it looks like it doesn't like the British pound. That's fine. And we can go back to blank, where there's nothing. We can go back to Canadian dollar. We can do this all day. But effectively, what we've done is we've figured out a way to, A, get user input to your website through the select field, which you could have also done through a form or a radio button, etc. And then process that input using using event listeners to make sure when it's changed. We then get certain information from this API by using our async awaits. And then we can output the information from that API onto our website by modifying existing HTML divs, by nesting new divs that we create within it, whose content we can change. That's about it for lecture. Any questions about this so far? Everything mostly making sense?
I'm having a real hard time with all these methods, like understanding what to use where and when, because I feel like with JavaScript, there's a lot more that I just, it feels like every time we do this, there's two new things that I've never seen before.
That is unfortunately kind of the norm with JavaScript. There, yeah, there's a lot of methods that even I don't know about. And the main thing that really comes in handy is going down the rabbit hole through the Mozilla documentation, which is extremely thorough. Hey, have you guys all seen the Mozilla docs before?
You're talking about MDN sheets?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
All right. Is there anyone who is not familiar with it? All right. So if not, I'm just gonna screen share this for a second. So the MDN, or I think it's Mozilla Developer Notes, um, they have created a bunch of reference guides for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, everything listed on the screen. And their JavaScript references are seriously like some of the best documentation you'll ever find on the internet. So let's say if you're having trouble understanding async awaits, they have a entire guide on how to use promises and how they work. For example, here with web forms, which is something you guys may look to use tonight, they talk about form elements. Like they don't just have examples, they have explanations, they have sample code. Like it is a treasured resource. So if you have trouble with things in the full stack world, before ChatGPT, before W3 scores, going to the MDN web docs is so helpful. I cannot recommend it enough. And I do highly recommend it for tonight's assignment. But to go back to your question, Justin, or your comment, unfortunately, with JavaScript, a lot of times the lines between different functions get blurred very quickly because they all seem like they're doing the same thing. Like, for example, async and await, they both deal with time and they both return things that look funny, like promises and responses. So, can't you use them interchangeably? Unfortunately, not. And the reason for that, again, as we kind of talked about, is more than a surface level explanation. So my only real consolation is if you go through the documentation, that's really the main way that'll help you sort of recognize the differences between functions and their use cases. But otherwise, it just takes time to get used to.
So it's probably pretty normal for JavaScript to feel painfully slow as you're developing then.
Oh
It
yeah,
sure
that's
does
why
for
I
me.
much prefer Python. But
Okay.
JavaScript, we have to deal with it, and so here we are. But the dev process for it does sometimes feel slower, which is also, again, where pseudocoding and breaking things out into chunks really happen, or is really useful. Because the one thing I can say about JavaScript, even despite my numerous complaints about it, is if you're able, before you jump into writing your code, to design it in such a way that everything is compartmentalized, kind of like we did at the start, which is where we talked about, how do we figure out what currency the user has? How do we, get the exchange rates for that currency? How do we, change all of these things? How do we create these new elements, etc.? If you can compartmentalize your code before you start writing it and then execute on that, that'll make it so much easier to go through the documentation and figure out what function you need to plug in where. Otherwise, it can be painful sometimes. Any other questions? comments or concerns?